I wanted to start by focusing on today's first reading from the letter of James. Notice how he says, "Beloved, do not grumble against one another so that you may not be judged. See, the judge is standing at the door." In other words, the judge or the judgment that you are going to undergo is very near. So whether he was referring to the second coming of Christ or our own eventual death, which, as I mentioned so often, is probably nearer than we think, we need to prepare ourselves for eternity. So what is this grumbling, and why would we be judged for grumbling? So grumbling is basically complaining. So we can grumble against people, like directly to them. We grumble, we complain, but we sometimes also grumble against others to other people. In other words, we're gossiping, we're complaining. And why do we complain in the first place? Well, we have to make a judgment, and we're judging that this person or that person is doing something inappropriate. We feel it's inappropriate, we feel it's wrong, we feel it's somehow having a negative impact upon us. So we grumble. We grumble, we complain, we make accusatory statements, we put that person down, we criticize that person. We do all these things. Remember what our Lord says, do not judge, right? And you will be judged with the measure that you use. So if we are judging others harshly, then we will be judged harshly. And basically, this is what he's saying. Now, he actually gives a solution to this problem, a kind of antidote, how to avoid this from happening, how to overcome this from happening. And he says, as an example of suffering and patience, beloved, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. And then he even mentions Job, and as you know, Job suffered a lot, and in one sense, yeah, he complained to God, but he was also resigned to his suffering. He didn't rebel against God. And, when it comes to, something, when it says do not grumble, it doesn't mean that when there's injustice, you shouldn't speak out against injustice. But how do we speak out against injustice? Even there, we should speak out in a charitable fashion. And, we need to speak out against evils in society, but, grumbling, just complaining isn't going to do anything good. So if there is some injustice, we need to speak out. We may need to speak directly to the person who's causing that injustice towards us, but we need to try to do it charitably. But basically, he's saying that suffering, right? This, as an example of suffering and patience, take the prophets. So we are called to accept a certain amount of mistreatment from others. We are called to accept a certain suffering for ourselves. And when we have this attitude of acceptance, we are less likely to complain, to grumble. So in other words, suffer with patience, suffer patiently, because suffering is a part of life. We can't escape it. We have physical ailments, we might have psychological issues, we might have opposition from others, we might have irritation from the people we live with. All of these things, we are called to be resigned to them. We are called to do the best that we can, especially when we can't avoid these things. And this brings me to today's gospel reading. The Pharisees, they want to test our Lord. They ask about divorce. Is it lawful to divorce someone? And it's kind of, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Women really didn't have much choice. They were stuck with the husband they got. They didn't have that privilege. So it was definitely, men had kind of superiority over women. And at the time of our Lord, there were actually two schools of thought amongst the rabbis. One of them had the attitude that you could divorce your wife for the slightest occasion. If she burnt your food, you could just divorce her. The other school of thought, which was more conservative and more correct, was only for some very serious offense. Like let's say she was unfaithful or something, right? So only for a serious offense. So there were these two schools of thought. But notice what our Lord says, that, from the beginning, God made them male and female. And once they are joined, they become like one flesh. And what do we understand by this one flesh? When we think of the human body, I have two hands, I have 2 feet, and every part of my body has to work for the good of the whole. If my feet had a mind of their own and one foot wants to go that way, the other foot wants to go that way, I cannot go either direction. I'm stuck, right? So they have to work together. And the couples have to work together for the good of the whole. And so the two become an organic whole. And, especially when they have children, in their children, the two actually become one flesh. The child is a combination of the two, the genetics of the two. It's a unique person, of course, but we see this, the fruit of marriage, or the fruit of love in the child. So couples are called to work together. Now, the problem often is that because of our inclination to sin, because of our fallen human nature, we're prone to give in to pride and selfishness, and this causes conflicts. And often what happens within marriages, grumbling starts to happen. Grumbling, right? What St. James is talking about. Complaining about this, complaining about that. Now, once again, if there's a legitimate thing that you need to address, some injustice taking place, well, yes, address that, but try to address that charitably. And sometimes that's part of the problem. We don't know how to address things. We're upset about something, and because we're upset, our attitude is already way off the mark, right? So, take, for example, a wife says to her husband, you don't love me because you did this or you did that. Well, it's a very accusatory statement. He's already going to be on the defensive. It's just going to cause more conflict. So what people recommend is, how do you say these things? The way she should say it is, when you did that, you made me think, or you made me feel like you didn't love me. So I may be wrong in what I thought. I may have misinterpreted your action or why you were doing that, but this is what I thought. And I want you to understand that this is how I felt because you did that. You see, it's a very different approach. It's no longer accusing the person. It's just saying, well, this is how I felt when you did this or that. So how we address situations, how we address people can make a huge difference. And yeah, we all tend to fail, but the ideal is we learn from our mistakes, but it's important that we actually make the effort to, do things correctly. Now, when it comes to marriage, yes, when the couple are initially married, it's wonderful and they have their honeymoon, but there's a saying that the honeymoon tends to wear off rather quickly. And the true test of love begins after the honeymoon wears off. And so love is something that we have to work at. So whether you're married or not, we're called to love everyone. And yes, we have preferences. We like some people more than others. But the ideal is that we try to practice charity towards everyone. And when it comes to marriage, as I mentioned, we have this inclination to sin, to pride, to selfishness. We all have that, whether we are married or not. And unless we have God in our lives, and unless we're consciously fighting against our pride and our selfishness, we're going to have major conflicts. Even when we are fighting against our pride and our selfishness, we're still going to have conflicts, but they're going to be more minor. They're going to be easier to solve. They're going to be easier to resolve. It's going to be easier to reconcile with your spouse or your friend or whoever it may be. And this is why it's so essential, I would say, for married couples to have God as the center of their lives. Because if they don't have God in the center of their lives, then they're just going to fall into sin, they're going to fall into pride, they're going to fall into selfishness, and they're going to have major conflicts, and they're going to grumble, they're going to complain, and eventually they're going to divorce. We see this happening today. Imagine if every person who's married was genuinely striving to be the best Christian possible, to forgive all offenses. Marriages would last much better than they do today. Statistics show that 50% of marriages end in divorce. Couples who cohabit or live together before marriage, 75% of those couples end in divorce. There may be different reasons for that. One of them is, obviously, if they're cohabiting, God is definitely not the center of their lives. So it's already a strike against them. So anyways, God needs to be the center of all of our lives. And yes, suffering is a part of our life here on earth. We have to be willing to accept a certain amount of suffering. We shouldn't grumble. If there is some injustice that we need to address it. Address it charitably. Otherwise, keep quiet. So something to think about for ourselves. We all tend to love to complain and to commiserate or to talk about our problems and things like that. But often it does a lot of harm, especially when we're talking about others. So as St. James says, we will be judged. So we ought to be we ought to take this very seriously. Just a brief announcement. Tomorrow, the pilgrim statue of Our Lady of the Cape is coming to our parish at 4 p.m. We will have the statue here in the parish. We will pray the rosary. I will be hearing confessions. There will be a priest at the Mass accompanying the statue of Our Lady, talking about the miracles associated with her. And after the Mass, there will be an indoor procession, candlelight procession. We will sing Marian hymns, and you will be able to venerate the statue of Our Lady up until about 9 p.m. And there will also be I think a basket where you could put petitions, and there's also one out in the foyer, and the one out in the foyer is the one that will be taken to the Eucharistic Congress with the pilgrim statue of Our Lady of the Cape. So I think there's sheets out there that you can write your petition on to Our Lady of the Cape. As I mentioned, she's the principal Marian she's the principal Marian statue of Canada, or the principal Marian devotion for Canadians. So good to honor her.